Hi guys, welcome to Med Academy, and on today's video we'll be talking about the spinal cord. And simply for today's video I'll be looking at some critical aspects of the spinal cord. I'll be telling you what the spinal cord is. I'll be talking about the spinal segment. I'll be talking about the blood supply, the meninges, and a bit on the spinal nerves. And we'll talk more on this in the next video. So let's quickly look at what the spinal cord is. Instead of giving you a broad definition, I'll just give you an analogy. You have your computer and you have different USB cords connecting the mouse, the keyboard, and other accessories that you need for the computer. Now, once the USB is disconnected, the mouse loses its function, the keyboard loses its function, and so forth. So this is simply the function of the spinal cord. It is a relay center. It is like a pathway between your brain and the rest of your body. So it would send information, like I told you, that the central nervous system or the nervous system receives information, processes it, and sends out command. So it is done through the spinal cord, which is a continuation of the brainstem. And that brings us to the topography of the spinal cord. So in the diagram on the board, we can see that we actually have our brain here. We have the brain, we have the cerebellum, and the spinal cord will begin as a continuation of the brainstem from the medulla oblongata. So this here is your medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord continues at this level where you have your foramen magnum, and it will descend downward to the region of your L1, L2 vertebrae. Here you have your L1, L2 vertebrae. And at this point, you have the conus medullaris in adults. And I told you that in infants or in early childhood, the spinal cord will actually end at the L3 level of the vertebral column. And if you look clearly at the spinal cord, which we have like I said here, we have the foramen magnum. So if you look clearly, you will see that there are two enlargements in the spinal cord. We have what we call the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. Now the cervical enlargement is between C4 and T1. So it extends from C4 to T1. And your lumbar enlargement is between your L2 and S3. So what is the enlargement we have in the spinal cord? The enlargement is simply a region where we have a lot of neurons that are compiled in a single area, because that region actually requires more motor function. For example, in the cervical enlargement, we have neurons responsible for your arms, your hands, and your fingers. And so we actually need a lot of neurons here to fire the signals. And in the lumbar enlargement, we have neurons that are actually congregated in this region that are responsible for your leg, your limbs, and your foot. And so hence we have this enlargement. And the next thing we'll also look about in the spinal cord: how many segments does the spinal cord have? The spinal cord have 31 segments, and each of these segments is formed from a pair of spinal roots. So here you have your spinal roots, and then this spinal root gives rise to this is your spinal root. This is your spinal root, and this is your spinal nerve. So the spinal cord has 31 segments, and we have the cervical segment, the thoracic segment, the lumbar segment, the sacral segment, and the coccygeal segment. So in the cervical segment, which I will mark as C, we actually have 8 pairs of spinal nerves. In the thoracic segment, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. In the lumbar segment, we have 5 pairs of cranial nerves. In the sacral segment, we have what? 5 pairs of spinal nerves. And in the coccygeal segment, we have just 1 pair of spinal nerve. If you do the maths, you will see that totally we would have what? 31 pairs of cranial nerves, and hence the spinal cord has 31 segments. And it is different from the arrangement of the vertebral cord. So this spinal segment actually does not correspond with what the vertebrae we have. And so when you have what? C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, you now have what? A +1, where you have what? The 7th vertebrae. And then at the what? Caudal part of your thoracic vertebrae, we have what? 12 of this spinal segment. So it will begin going what? 2 per what? Vertebrae. And then at the caudal part, we now be what? Having what? 3 pairs per what? Vertebral location. And where it gets interesting, so let me just do this. So where you have T10, your vertebrae T10 to T12, you will have what? The spinal segment L1 to L4 coming from this region. And where you have your vertebrae T12 and L1, you actually have the segments of what? L5 to S2 coming out. And where you have your vertebrae L1 and L2, you will actually have your segment S3 and down to what? Coccygeal 1 coming out. So this is how what you can actually what? Locate the spinal nerves in correspondence to the vertebral column. So we have actually spoken about the enlargements, we have spoken about the segments, and we have spoken about the topography as regards to the vertebral. So the next thing I would like us to actually look on is actually the external features of the spinal cord. So when you look at the spinal cord, if you look critically from the front view, you will see this groove here, and this is actually known as the anterior median fissure. And this is actually the location where we would be having the anterior spinal artery. I will talk on the blood supply shortly. And if you take a look here, you will see this spinal nerves at this region. So this sulcus where the nerves are coming from is known as the what? Anterior lateral sulcus. And the next structure you want to look at when you look at the external view, posteriorly, just like we have this anterior view, posteriorly you will also have, if you look posteriorly to this, you will have what? The posterior median sulcus. Posteriorly. And posteriorly you will also find what? The posterior lateral sulcus also. So this is one thing I want you to actually what? Get from the what? External structure of the spinal cord. And we'll now be talking about what? The internal structure of the spinal cord. And for the internal structure, I spoke a bit on this when I was doing neurulation. Here you have your what? You have the what? Gray matter. And this I already explained in the previous video, that here you have the what? Anterior horn of the spinal cord. Here you have the posterior horn of the spinal cord. And here you have the what? Lateral horn of the spinal cord. And I explained this in the previous video, so you should actually go back and watch that video. And interestingly, we would have here the anterior funiculus, and posteriorly we'll have the posterior funiculus, And laterally, we have the lateral funiculus. And in the next video, I will explain extensively the function of the anterior funiculus, the lateral and posterior funiculus, and the different tracts we actually have in each of these segments. And in the gray matter of the spinal cord also, there are different nuclei that can be found. And I will explain this in the next video. And so now, let's look at the blood supply of the spinal cord. The blood supply of the spinal cord is majorly provided by the vertebral artery. So just before the vertebral artery comes together to give rise to the basilar artery, the vertebral artery will give rise to the anterior spinal artery. And this is the artery that I told you would run in this anterior median fissure. So the first artery we are going to take note of is the anterior spinal artery, which runs in this anterior median fissure. So we have the anterior spinal artery. The next artery I want us to look at is the posterior spinal artery. And the posterior spinal artery is formed by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, PICA. So the next is the posterior spinal artery, which is formed from PICA. And the posterior spinal artery will run posteriorly. This is the anterior view, but I'm just showing how it will run. It will run posteriorly on the spinal cord. And the next supply I want to actually talk about is the supply that actually gets people confused. And these arteries are known as the radicular spinal arteries. So I will write here the radicular spinal artery. And what I want you to know about this artery is that the artery are actually branches of other arteries that just run with the spinal nerve down the spinal root to give supplies to it. And so for the cervical part of the spinal cord, the radicular arteries will be provided by the ascending cervical artery, the deep cervical artery, and the vertebral artery. For the thoracic part of the spinal cord, the radicular arteries will be provided by the supreme intercostal arteries, the posterior intercostal arteries, the subcostal artery, and the deep cervical artery. The lumbar segment of the spinal cord, the radicular spinal arteries there would be provided by the lumbar artery and the iliolumbar artery. And finally, the sacral segment will actually be provided for by the lateral sacral artery. The last blood supply would actually be coming from an artery which is known as the Adam-Kiewicz artery. And research has proven that the artery usually originates from the left side of the aorta. And this is found around the region of from T9 to T12. And so we have Adam-Kiewicz artery. So these are the major blood supply for the spinal cord. that I've listed below. And the next thing we'll look at what the venous drainage of the spinal cord. And so now we'll actually be looking at the venous drainage of the spinal cord. And here we just have what? Three important plexus. The first, we have what? The internal vertebral venous plexus. And this is found in the epidural space. And I'll be looking at the meninges of the spinal cord so you understand the epidural space. But this venous plexus is found there. And the next relay point for the venous drainage is the external vertebral venous plexus, which is located on the vertebral bodies. And the last plexus is the basovertebral plexus, which connects the external and the internal venous plexuses, and they help for the drainage of blood from the spinal cord. And so lastly, let's look at the meninges. For the meninges, for the spinal meninges, we have what? The dura mater, which is a thick fibrous layer, the dura mater. And the next, we have what? The arachnoid mater. And lastly, we would have the pia mater, which is the last protective layer of the spinal cord. So the dura mater is located between the vertebrae and the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is in between the pia mater and the dura mater. The pia mater mostly is attached to what? The spinal cord. And there are spaces which this meninges actually creates. And the first space is known as the epidural space. The epidural space. And it is in this epidural space that we'll be having what? The vessels and also fatty tissues. The next space would have is the what? Is the subdural. The subdural space. And the subdural space is the space in between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. And the other important space we'll be having is the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space is actually where we would have a lot of the cerebrospinal fluid. And so this is what the meninges and the spaces would have in the spinal cord. And lastly, I forgot to mention that after the conus medullaris that is located between L1 and L2, the other parts of the spinal cord you need to be conversant with is what we call the cauda equina. What is the cauda equina? The cauda equina is simply the nerve extensions that are extending downward from the conus medullaris. And lastly, we have what? Filum terminale. And the filum terminale is actually the pia mater. It is what the fibrous strands from the pia mater that is extending down to the coccyx to actually fixate the spinal cord and stabilize it. And so guys, this is actually a comprehensive introduction and explanation to what the spinal cord is and what it does, the various parts and functions. In the next video, I'll be going through the cross section of this spinal cord, and I'll be talking about the various nuclei. So please stay tuned and watch the next video when it is released. And if you actually want to get our free notes and PDFs, visit our website at www.landsmedacademy.com. See you in the next video. Thank you.